Hello. We are continuing to try out lighting situations. This seems like it might be the best and brightest. You let me know what you think. Is it too bright? I don't know. But today is my May wrap up, and let me tell you, I read so many good books in May. Before we get into that, this video is being sponsored by Book of the Month. As you all probably are familiar with by now, Book of the Month is a monthly subscription service where they curate 6 or 7 titles each month, and you get to pick a book from those selections. It's hassle-free, and you can cancel or skip a month at any time if none of those appeal to you. You can use the code SUMMER to get your first book for $9.99. Book of the Month has also recently released a podcast. You can listen and subscribe on Apple or Spotify, and it's called Virtual Book Tour. It's hosted by 2 members of the Book of the Month editorial team, and so far is already trending on podcast charts. And on the podcast, they do author interviews so you can get some behind the scenes looks at those authors and their wisdom. There is a link in the description for more information about the podcast and for the code to get your own Book of the Month box. My selection this month is The Stardust Thief by Chelsea Abdullah, and this is a Middle Eastern inspired epic fantasy story that follows jinn and jinn magic and a thief getting all caught up in that. And I have other book series like this that I really love, so I'm looking forward to this for sure. I really appreciate when Book of the Month includes fantasy and sci-fi selections in their curated picks. So if you are interested in checking out Book of the Month for yourself, as well as checking out the podcast, all the information is linked down below. Now, let's get into my wrap up for May. Like I said, I read a lot of really good books in May. Contrary to that, the first book that I finished in May was my least favorite book, possibly of the year. And that was The Bone Season by Samantha Shannon. This is the first book in this series. I think the whole series is called The Bone Season, but I'm not exactly sure because I don't care because I'm not finishing the series. But it's an adult urban fantasy series, but I hesitate to say that. It's more just like contemporary fantasy because urban fantasy has a different feel because it's set in the city. Anyway. And in this world, there are different kinds of like almost spirit magic, dream magic, things like that. And our main character has a very rare form of that. And early on in the story, even though she is working for like a crime syndicate of people who are clairvoyants, clairvoyancy is like the general overarching term for these like different magic users. She ends up being arrested because to have this kind of magic is illegal, and she is basically taken prisoner, and everything kind of goes from there. While the premise of this is fairly interesting in theory, it is just so not what I expected. It was incredibly bland. This was our House Alt Book Club pick for last month, so you can hear us talk about all of our thoughts on this book over there. But overall, I found the writing to be poor, which is really sad because I really love Priory of the Orange Tree, which is one of her most recent books. But this was her first book. She wrote it when she was 19. I get it, but it's very poor. And the world building, while like elements of it could be really cool, the elements that I was really interested in we weren't really getting. There was a lot of info dumping and just characters telling our main character things. Our main character had like zero agency, which for someone being a prisoner is not always necessarily a bad thing, but it was like to an extreme. And then the romance elements were bad and just very of its time. I think this came out in like 2013 or something, so it's a very dated book. People have said the series gets better. However, this nearly put me in a reading slump, so I don't plan on continuing. And typically speaking, for my urban fantasy, I tend to prefer urban fantasy that leans more into paranormal and like a lot of different like types of paranormal creatures being explored, and this is not that kind of book. So while the magic system could have been really cool, I think other series probably do it better. This was a 1 star for me. Then, the next book that I read saved me from getting into a reading slump, and that is Book Lovers by Emily Henry. Pretty much everyone has been screeching about this book. I've already done a full review for it as well, so I'll link that on the screen. But this is another one of Emily Henry's adult contemporary romances. This is following Nora, who is from New York City, and her last 3 relationships have ended when her city boyfriends have gone to the country, kind of like a Hallmark movie, and basically left her for the small town life. But she keeps saying how she's like the one that gets left, the intense one, the one that loves the city, whatever. Well, her younger sister ends up taking her to a small town that one of her author's books is based on because Nora is a literary agent, and it was like, we should do this bucket list and whatever. And that's kind of where the story goes. In and of itself, doesn't sound super interesting, but then we had this element of her sort of rival, they're not quite rivals, but they had butt heads years ago. Charlie, a book editor, he ends up also being in this town, and they have a lot of banter and things, and that sort of takes off. So this is a combination, not only a romance, but also just Nora and her sister and the sister dynamics and all this stuff. What I love about Emily Henry's books is she has a really masterful way of combining just the like literary elements, women's fiction, I hate that term, but like the women's fiction type elements with a romance where neither one is lacking, and it just makes it such a fully fleshed out story. I love her books. I love these characters. This might be my favorite. It's really between this one and Beach Read, which was my favorite, but I love that she doesn't tend to go for the third act breakup. There's third act conflict, which I think is much more realistic for a romance book. Everything about this I loved. I related to Nora so much. Their relationship is like literal goals, her and Charlie, and I adore this. So I gave this one 5 out of 5 stars. It saved me. Then I read A Closed and Common Orbit by Becky Chambers. This was my Patreon book pick for the month before last actually, but I ran out of time because of moving. This one I also have a full review for. This is the second book in the Wayfarer's Companion series by Becky Chambers, but this is a companion series where they all exist as standalones. You don't have to read the other ones. There may be a little bit of context, but honestly, you can read them all separately. I read them in the order of first, third, then second. I'm about to read the fourth, so you can read them in any order. But anyway, this one follows our main characters of Lovelace and Pepper, who were both characters that were minor in the first book. Lovelace is an AI, artificial intelligence, and due to circumstances that happened in the first book, she is now trying to figure out like who she is, her identity, outside of being artificial intelligence on a ship. Pepper is the person taking care of her, who is like a mechanic, and so we have this happening in 2 timelines because we have current day with Lovelace and Pepper, and then we have the past, Pepper's past, where we discover how her life is intertwined with like AI in the past. And the stories really beautifully mirror each other. They explore those themes that I really love of AI and like what makes a human, what makes a person, what makes a machine, coming of age in like a robot sense, all of that stuff I always really enjoy. And then I just really love Becky Chambers' worlds of slice of life sci-fi where bad things can happen, but nothing is super bad, and people and relationships are the main focus, and I love these. So I gave this one 5 out of 5 stars. Like I said, I love all the different aliens, I love the world, I love what she does with themes, I love her writing. Even though these could be interpreted as slow books, I always want to keep picking them up. I just deeply care about her characters and I love what she does. Then I had a little reread, and that was Deadly Education by Naomi Novik. I reread this on audiobook, and when I originally read this when it first came out back in 2020, I liked it but didn't love it. We read it for book club. There were some things that it like didn't really hit the mark for me. On reread, I loved this. I don't know if I was just like in the mood for it. I don't know if the audiobook made it better. I did read an arc when I first read it, so I don't know if things were like changed. I don't have a lot of perception of 2020, but I loved this. I was really happy to be back in the world. I remembered most of it. This is basically, I should go into what it's about. This follows teenagers essentially that are in a magical school / college, like they're older teens pretty much, and everyone that has magical abilities gets sent to the school where there are no teachers. Like the school kind of magically runs itself, and they have to like learn magic there, and magic is very difficult, and the school is essentially trying to kill them, but outside of the school is more dangerous than that because there's basically these creatures that want to like eat magic and like mana and like the kind of magic that they have. So they're just basically trying to survive school. And our main character has run-ins with like the school golden boy, White Knight, who keeps saving a bunch of people, but she's like, I hate him because he's cutting off my chances at opportunities at the school, which there's like a whole dynamics there. Anyway, too much to get into. But the audiobook, I loved. I enjoyed this when I first read it too, but like the audiobook just, I don't know, resonated with me more this time around. I love the world. The world always stuck out to me, like just how deadly and interesting it is. The characters stuck out to me more this time around. The side characters seemed more real in the audiobook for some reason. So I really enjoyed them. I enjoyed our main character, who can be a little bit unlikable and stubborn. I liked her dynamic with the guy, like everything. So I'm very pleased, and I actually gave it 5 out of 5 stars on reread, and I'm really looking forward to the sequel, which I do have. Hopefully I'll read that next month. That's the plan. Then I also listened to Artificial Condition by Martha Wells. This is the second book in the Murderbot Diaries, which are a series of novellas. There's now been a full-size novel, I think, that follows Murderbot, who is a like part human or like part biological, part AI construct bots who typically are used as security. So that's why they're called like murder bots. That's sort of the colloquial name that they go by. And stuff happened in the first book and we're just continuing to follow their story, but this is basically following a socially anxious AI as they're trying to navigate the world. What was fun about this book is we have additional AI in this book, and as I mentioned earlier, I love a good AI story. I still do not resonate a ton with these books. They're fun, they're fine. I enjoy them when I'm listening to them on audio, but when I am not reading them, I don't really think of them. I'm not super invested or connected, but they're easy, quick audiobooks, and I think I'm gonna continue to read them. I gave this 3 out of 5 stars. It's fine. I think it's hard with novella series because they have to be sort of building up to something and there's not a lot of time, so you don't have a ton of time to get invested, but I still plan on continuing to read these. Then I had to reread another Patreon book pick because this month for May, I selected a bunch of books that I wanted to reread and I asked them to pick one for me to prioritize. I ended up going with Sabriel by Garth Nix. That's the one that they chose. This is my 3rd time rereading this book, so it is one of my all-time favorite books. So this is the first in a young adult, although it reads honestly more like adult, fantasy series that follows our main character, Sabriel. She is the daughter of the Aporson. The Aporson is essentially a necromancer, but a necromancer that instead of raising the dead, puts the dead back where they belong. And in this world, there is a wall between the Old Kingdom, which is like the fantastical world, and then like essentially our world, although it's not, but it seems a little bit more like modern day, or modern day when this was written, which was like the 90s. So our character grows up in sort of like the modern world with magic, and then something happens. She gets a message from her father that he might be in trouble, and she has to go back into the Old Kingdom and figure out what's going on. This is one of my favorite series of all time. I've reread Sabriel the most. I do plan on continuing now with this and rereading the other 2 books in the series. That happens to follow a different character, which is why I've never resonated with it quite as much, but I wanted to reread this to continue because I, like I said, reread this 3, maybe even 4 times, and I've only read those 2 once. Anyway, I love this. I love the world in this. The world in this is so cool. There's different kinds of magic. There's different kinds of like creatures. The dead things, this is the start of my thing with necromantic powers and characters that can go between life and death. This is where that started when I read this in high school. I think I was like 15. So this character can control the dead using bells, and the bells will like bind the dead into literally the river of death. Like she can go into death, walk along the river, sort of like the river Styx, but more complicated. There's multiple different gates of death until you get into like being fully dead, and things, creatures are in there. It's so cool. This has one of the best animal companions of all time, Mogget, who is not just a cat, but is a magical talking cat, but more than a cat. I enjoy the plot. I enjoy everything. In reality, it is probably a 4-star book. Like when I sit here and I go into my spreadsheet and enter in my realistic numbers for everything, rating all the different things that I rate on a scale, it comes out to being about a 4. I always change it to a 5 because in my heart of hearts, this is a 5-star book. Do I see its faults? Sure. From pure enjoyment and the way this has shaped my life, it's a 5. I will be doing a full review on this soon, so you can hear more of my in-depth thoughts because I haven't really reread this since I think I started my channel. And the last book that I read was The Dragon Republic by R.F. Kuang. This is the 2nd book in the Poppy War series. I have a review for the 1st book, so I'll leave that on the screen. This picks up directly after the events of the 1st book and is following a main character, Rin, who has magical abilities from things that happened in the 1st book, and she is living in a war-torn country where she is basically used as a weapon, and a lot of shit happened at the end of the last book, and so she's reeling from that, and this is her kind of trying to come to terms with a lot of that as war is still continuing. I will be doing a full review on this as well, and a spoilery discussion for anybody that's interested in more of my in-depth thoughts. I was expecting to love this as much as I love The Poppy War, which is a 5-star book for me. A lot of people talk about how much this is their favorite book in the series. This one was a little bit worse than The Poppy War. Not worse. It's not a bad book. It just didn't resonate quite as much as The Poppy War did. The world I continue to enjoy. This is a very, very, very brutal war fantasy story. So it is based on real events that happened in China and surrounding Japan and things with the Sino-Japanese War that was happening and the events after that. Very, very brutal, based on real things, but this is not historical fantasy. It's just based on some of those historical events. So as you probably know, look up all the trigger warnings. There's trigger warnings for everything. Graphic descriptions of gore, violence, torture, rape, child death, everything. So just be aware of that. This one also heavily features drug abuse as well. So a lot of heavy themes, and I feel like this pacing-wise was much slower than the first book. Not that that's a bad thing, but much slower than I was expecting for what was going on, and certain parts of it felt kind of clunky. It's also a little bit of a frustrating story because Rin, our main character, is going through a lot, and she takes like a little bit of time to get to some of the obvious things, which sometimes characters do that. But the thing that kind of made it not completely stick the landing for me was that there are a lot of character relationships in here that aren't really shown to us, are more so kind of told, and I feel like we could have had more in-depth looks at these relationships because they're very close and like very important, and we don't really get to see a lot of them, so I don't quite believe them. And they're not even just romantic relationships, they're like platonic, like just connections. So I felt more arm's length from all of the like side characters and the people that were connected to Rin. I still really love her, but I felt more at a distance from those characters, which made it so it wasn't quite a 5-star. Still a solid 4 though. I'm looking forward to the finale, and I'm hoping that I love it just as much as the Poppy War, and I still really think this series is good. So 4 out of 5 stars. So yeah, that is it. Those are all the books that I read in May. So comment below and let me know how your reading month went. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see all of you guys soon. Bye.